Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you for this afternoon's special event. Can you do whatever you have to your mobile phone so that it doesn't make a noise, but do keep it on, and feel free to tweet. The hashtag today is RSA Metropolitan if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. We're also live streaming the event, so hello to our online viewers. Sometimes I get the opportunity in chairing these events to chair an event with a hero of mine, and today that's what we're doing. So I'm delighted to welcome Bruce Katz. As some of you may know, this is a week in which the RSA launched its City Growth Commission, which is an independent authoritative inquiry into how best to enable England's major cities to drive growth and respond to future fiscal and economic challenges. We're delighted that Bruce is agreed to be a member of that Commission. He is a distinguished expert and advisor on successful American urban policy making and regeneration. He's Vice President of the Brookings Institution, a not-for-profit public policy organisation based in Washington, D.C., arguably the world's leading think tank of its kind. He's also founding director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Programme. He's here now because he's co-author of the Metropolitan Revolution, How Cities and Metros Are Fixing Our Broken Politics and Fragile Economy, which describes a national movement where networks of city leaders are building competitive city economies driven by innovation, exports and sustainability. I was so impressed when I read the book, even before I think it had been published, that I contacted Radio 4 and said, you need to make a programme about this guy's ideas, they're really important. And that programme analysis will actually be going out on Monday, so, and will feature many interviews with Bruce and with Jennifer Bradley, his collaborator on this book. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bruce Katz.
So thank you, Matthew, and a big follower of Matthew's blog and the RSA, and feel at home here with a Benjamin Franklin room. So really happy to visit here for the first time. So let me take you through about 20 minutes of the major themes of this book. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. The United States, and I would say the UK and Europe, are living through a pivotal decade. We are still experiencing the aftermath of the Great Recession. There's a reason it was called great. We still have to grow 8.3 million jobs to make up the jobs we lost during the downturn and to keep pace with population and labor dynamics. But more importantly, we need to grow better jobs because we saw a quantum leap in the number of people living in poverty and near poverty in the last decade, from 81 million in 2000 to 107 million in 2011. Now, in theory, when you have these kind of great challenges, you have to think about restructuring, quote unquote, your growth model from an economy pre-recession that was characterized by consumption and debt, and in the United States, home building and steroids and financial engineering, to an economy essentially fueled by innovation, not just idea generation, but production, technology-led growth, powered by low-carbon advanced energy, driven by exports and foreign investment and global engagement. Now, also in theory, you might need a national government to help set a platform for that restructuring. We have a minor problem in the United States. Our federal government has essentially, like Elvis, left the building, and there are times when we're not sure it's coming back. But we have another structural shift in the US, which I think may play itself out in similar ways here and in Europe, which is because of the aging of our society. What our national government actually does is beginning to change. Over the next 10 years, the US federal government will spend about $1.2 to $1.5 trillion more a year on Medicare and Medicaid, that's our healthcare spending, and Social Security, our retirement benefits. And so what that will begin to do is squeeze down investments, crowd out investments in some minor things like defense and infrastructure and research and development and housing. And within a relatively short period of time, about 52% of what our federal government does is just going to be healthcare and retirement. So in some ways, the national government in the US is becoming a very large health insurance company with an army. And essentially, it's sending a signal to everyone else in our system, not just city and metropolitan elected leaders or governors, but to the broader network of institutions and leaders that co-produce our economy and co-govern our communities. You're now in charge. right, of really setting the destiny for your places and making these economy-shaping, place-making investments. So that brings us to the revolution. What we see happening across the United States in the absence of federal leadership are cities and metropolitan areas stepping up and doing the hard work to grow jobs and grow a more productive, innovative, sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. Now, they're doing that because they can. We have 388 metropolitan areas in the United States. A quarter of them sit on an eighth of our land mass. They're 2/3 of our population. They're 3/4 of our GDP. And on every single indicator that powers a modern, sophisticated economy, whether it's skilled workers, whether it's infrastructure to move people, goods, energy, services, ideas, or whether it's innovation, however we measure innovation, there's 75, 80, 85, 90% of the national share. For all intents and purposes, there is no American economy. What we are is a network of metropolitan economies. And to some extent, the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, is because these places are urbanizing and industrializing. They're becoming more like us. In the aftermath of the recession, what city and metropolitan leaders are doing is changing their growth model. Why don't you listen to this?
For decades, the United States built its economy on debt and consumption. For cities, this meant throwing public money at sports arenas and stealing businesses from their neighbors with tax breaks. But what about after the game? You can't build an economy around beer and hot dogs. And what happens when the businesses you stole leave for a better deal somewhere else? The Great Recession was a wake-up call. We forgot the fundamentals. Productive and innovative growth drive consumption, not the other way around. Smart metro leaders are going back to basics, investing in infrastructure, making manufacturing a priority again, connecting small businesses with investors in new markets, helping workers get the skills they need. If metros get the basics right, the beer and hot dogs will follow.
Mayors don't like that video because they were subsidizing minor league sports teams in the last couple of years. But this really sends the point. Post-recession, we have to get back to fundamentals, right? What drives what? Here are the stories in our book. Denver and Los Angeles using local resources to finance state-of-the-art modern transit, not just to move people through congested metros, but also to send a signal to the world. We're going to be a sustainable metropolis in the 21st century and an attractive place for innovative firms and talented workers. Northeast Ohio, philanthropy and business coming together to support a network of small and medium-sized manufacturing firms, the recognition we still make things in the United States and we export those things, and they're helping small firms toughen up their business plans, retool their facilities, retrain their workers, and prepare their products for global markets. In New York, I'll go into this with a little more detail, but a radical shift in one decade from a growth model where they wanted to subsidize 2 sports stadia on the west side of Manhattan to compete for the 2012 Olympics, to a growth model where they're attracting world-beating engineering universities like Cornell and Technion to Roosevelt Island. Portland, a very weird and crunchy metropolitan area, right, where the hippies went in the United States, but an export powerhouse. One of the few cities and metros to double exports in the middle part of the last decade, and now with a targeted strategy to export to Asia and Latin America sustainable products and sustainable services, which Portland is very, very good at. And Houston, one of the most demographically diverse cities and metros in the United States, setting up a network of settlement houses to help integrate literally thousands of immigrants every year, giving them access to low-cost banking, English as a second language, charter schools, skills, healthcare. And finally, Detroit. And everyone knows the story of Detroit, 138 square miles, went from about 1.9 million in population in 1950 down to less than 700,000 today. In many parts of Detroit, a wasteland, tens of thousands of abandoned buildings. But in the heart of Detroit, the downtown, the riverfront, Canada actually sits to the south, up the old storied Woodward corridor to the Midtown, where you have Wayne State University and Henry Ford Health System, Detroit Medical Campus. Detroit is reviving from its core. Only 3% of its land mass, 40% of its population, but billions of corporate and civic investment happening in a city where essentially the local government doesn't even exist. So let's go to New York. And this is a story essentially of the depths of the recession, where Bloomberg and his team crowdsourced the idea of how to diversify an economy that was too dependent on financial services. What they've been able to do is attract a series of institutions, large-scale advanced research institutions, Cornell and Technion to Roosevelt Island, but they've also been working with other homegrown advanced universities on urban science, data science, and engineering. Look at the math of this. About $130 million of the city's capital budget put it to do, basically redo infrastructure to prepare for these advanced research institutions. $2 billion in private capital already raised to do the construction. Estimated about $30 billion over 30 years in private capital, 50,000 jobs, 1,000 startups. This is the kind of smart, strategic economic development that large cities and metropolitan areas need to follow than the consumption Starbucks and Stadia model that basically captured the pre-recession era. Let's listen to the deputy mayor talk about this plan.
As you look at the economy in New York, we have a lot of strengths, but it's clear everywhere in industry that technology is disrupting business models. And so while applied science and engineering can help startup companies, it's also required for the key industries that are already here.
These great institutions that have made a commitment to come to New York, not in an ivory tower tradition, but to partner with industry, to partner with the corporate community, to really design the next generation of whole industries.
It really is a momentum that has fed upon itself. You've seen the reality on the ground change, and as the reality on the ground has changed, I think the ambition of the various universities in turn has continued to ratchet up. And this is a virtuous cycle that we hope continues for many, many years into the future.
So the old notion, you want to grow an innovative, productive, resilient economy, go get an advanced research institution, wait 50 years and see what happens. Actually, I think the life cycle has been shortened to 3 or 5 or 7 years. New York City is now becoming a tech center, just like London is becoming a tech center. And the introduction of Cornell and Technion in our system, this is going to take this up to a whole nother level. Think about what this might mean for London. So here are our stories. We're sticking with them. There may be about another 25, frankly, we could have put in this book because there's so much pragmatic, affirmative energy that is bubbling up in the United States across these networks of political, corporate, civic, university, labor, environmental leaders on the ground, even while Washington is on a frolic and a detour. So how do you start a revolution? At least one that's peaceful. First, you create a network, right? It's critical to understand that when we talk about cities in the United States or when we talk about metropolitan areas, we are not talking about governments. The federal government is a government. States are governments. Whitehall is a government. Cities and metros are networks. That's why they're so powerful. So what's really critical is to create and steward networks. In New York City, that really was Bloomberg crowdsourcing the applied science idea with his team. In Northeast Ohio, the manufacturing story, it's really a network of networks and institutions. There's a fund for an economic future that's philanthropy-backed. There are cluster intermediaries dealing with bioscience, dealing with the retooling of the auto sector. And there are other institutions working with small and medium-sized manufacturers to give them access to private capital. In Detroit, it really is a loose affiliation of millionaires and billionaires, right? Different kinds of networks coming together all around this notion of let's revive from the core, and I'll talk about that a little more as we go. Second, you need a vision. In the pre-recession economy, we all had the sense that the consumption economy was ubiquitous. A Walmart in Phoenix or Pittsburgh is the same as a Walmart in Denver or Detroit. You know, same footprint, same prices, same design. That's why they're so profitable. But the traded economy, the productive economy, the innovative economy is differentiated. You know, what Phoenix trades is different from what Pittsburgh trades, and what makes Denver a global metropolis is different from what makes Detroit a global metropolis. So what's happening in the United States is city leaders are beginning to follow the maxim of the great 20th century philosopher Dolly Parton. Find out who you are and do it on purpose. So in New York, they looked at who they are, and they were not happy. Too much dependence on financial services, too little STEM in their system, science, technology, engineering, math. In Portland, they looked at themselves and said, hey, we're an export powerhouse. And not only that, we're at the vanguard of the clean industrial revolution, clean tech. We can export sustainable products and services to Asia and to Latin America. And then Detroit, in this sort of great landmass of despair, right? They looked at their core, only 3% of the landmass, and said, we've got unbelievable assets here. And if we could basically invest, primarily corporate civic, we can unlock more private capital, grow jobs, grow a tax base. Final piece is find your game changer. If you went around U.S. cities or metropolitan areas in the United States today and say, in the last 50 years, what was the major intervention that put you on a different economic trajectory, changed your profile, changed your performance? Many cities could answer that question. It's when we put down, when we tore down a freeway along the waterfront and put in transit, as Portland did. It's when we attracted a world-beating advanced research university like the University of Washington to Seattle back in the mid part of the last century to serve not just Washington State, but the whole Northwest. These transformative interventions, these game changers, really do change economic trajectory. New York, Northeast Ohio, Detroit, they're all game-changing initiatives around innovation. New York is about an institutional platform for innovation, this applied research, applied sciences. Northeast Ohio is the recognition that manufacturing is innovative, right? For a long time in the US, and I would say here, we thought about manufacturing as like the old dirty industry. Well, what are cars? They're computers on wheels, right? I mean, these are the most technologically sophisticated sectors of our economy, 90% of our patents. A country that doesn't make things will cease to be innovative over time. And finally, Detroit, the recognition that there's a different spatial geography of innovation in the 21st century. 15 years ago, if you wanted to find the innovation zones, go to a downtown, get in a car, drive 30 miles to a science park, and then you're basically in this sterile environment of closed corporate campuses, the notion of protect your secrets, don't talk to anyone else, and at the end of the day, just get back in your car and drive the 30 miles back to the city. Well, that's not what's happening today. People want to be in lively, vibrant, walkable, livable, bikeable, connected places, and firms want to be close to other firms, right? So you have that synergistic effect of a bump and mingle kind of environment. So as we go forward over the next several years, whether Washington does something incredibly brilliant or incredibly stupid, right? I think what really is going to happen in the United States is cities and metropolitan areas are really going to find their game changers and are going to find their way to leverage public, private, civic capital, but also expertise that is customized and aligned to their assets and their attributes and advantages. And here's really where we may end up.
From an early age, we are taught how our nation is supposed to work. The president, vice president, and members of Congress sit at the top. Governors and legislators run their states. The rest of us take our cues from them. While states and the federal government may be part of the Constitution, our population and economic power is actually concentrated in our metropolitan areas. It's time to rethink power in America. In this century, metros will lead, and states and the federal government will follow. In cities and metros, public, private, and civic leaders are helping workers get the skills they need, investing in infrastructure and growing jobs through expanded trade and investment, the hard work necessary to renew our economy.
The health and vitality of a nation as great as the United States is not dependent on 537 elected officials in Washington, D.C. Our power really grows from our cities and our metropolitan areas that are the engines of our economy and the centers of our trade and investment and on the front lines of demographic transformation and environmental change. And in this century, I think they will be the vanguard of policy innovation and social progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. That was fantastic. And I'm going to ask you a few questions before we open it up to the floor. And I hope you won't mind if I ask you to talk a bit about England, because things are different here, although I think as I explore in this programme in a few days, that there are interesting signs of catching up with this agenda. So let me start with a broader question, which is, do you think there are certain characteristics of the modern world which mean that the local is a better site for action, for social change than the national? Of course, the local and the national differ, but the city rather than the nation.
Yeah, I think the modern economy and modern society are networked rather than hierarchical. We're open sourced rather than closed sourced. Because change is so disruptive and so fast, you've got to be nimble, you've got to be entrepreneurial, you have to adapt quickly. Governments don't adapt quickly. That's like turning a super tanker. Because you've got to go through the old style legislative process, and there's something to that. But at the local level, or obviously in the business community, you've got to move. You got to move. And so I think cities and metros are really more aligned to the quickness of our modern economy and society. Obviously, the modern economy and society is really grounded in these places. But I think just the way they operate as networks, not as governments, is really well suited to our times.
Can we explore a couple of particular angles of that? I mean, my own hero of American city government is the fat-busting mayor of Oklahoma. And the reason I love his story, which I'm sure you're aware of, is the way in which he gave a sense of agency to his city. Yep. So, it seems to me that one of the elements of this, one of the reasons why we need to devolve power, is because we need the public to be part of the solutions that we develop. Absolutely. And as Ben Barber's arguing in his book that's coming out right now, people are starting to talk about that, If Mayors Ruled the World, it is actually, we are more likely to respond to the call to engage, to work together at the city level than at the national level.
Yeah, I think national government and state governments are really representative democracies. Cities and metros are participatory democracies. And they collectively problem solve because each constituency within a city or a metropolis, each sector, each discipline, each jurisdiction, frankly, brings something to the table that can be honored and leveraged. And when we talk about mayors, increasingly we don't talk about their formal power, the efficient delivery of services and so forth, which is a platform for business creation and job growth. We talk about their informal power, which is the ability to bring stakeholders together or other elected officials in a metropolis together. Each of these mayors or sectors are powerful by themselves, but when they all come together, they can do grand things together. So those are the great mayors, frankly. It's the ability to convene and the ability to inspire others to work together and crack the code.
When New Labour won in 1997, one of the things that we said when I was involved in that project was that we were going to join up government. And I remember someone telling me that who worked in Number 10, that they had been to 3 years, they'd been to the same civil service training day. In the first year, they'd said, we're going to join up government. And the civil servants had gone, that's absolutely great, brilliant, looking forward to it. And the second year, he'd said, we're joining up government. They'd be going, yeah, well, not sure. And the third year, he couldn't even say it without people shouting at him. So the point about that is that joining up government is a great aim, but actually in national government there are systematic reasons why it's incredibly difficult to get these huge departments to join up and collaborate and work effectively together. Again, there seems to be something, and let's face it, there's lots of silos in cities as well, and you might want to comment on why it is some cities are better than others at collaboration, but again, that joining up seems more possible at the local level.
Yeah, I think at the federal level and at the provincial or state level, you tend to think about government in subject matter or separate topics, so you create these separate silos and stovepipes. The Department of the Environment, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing, as if these things are separate from each other. I mean, and it tends to lead you down a path to think that every time you have a transportation problem, you need a transportation solution, or alternatively with the environment. And actually, solutions tend from the integration of things rather than the silo segmented. So I think what we're seeing is the triumph of 20th century specialized thinking. I mean, in the United States, we always used to say that joined-up government is an unnatural act between non-consenting adults. So, but I think with at the city level, it's organic, integrated. It's harmonious. And when we think about, there's congestion here, we don't jump, hey, let's build another ring road or widen the road or, build one on top. Well, maybe we should have more density, or maybe we should give people greater choice, walking, biking, transit. The thinking is different at the local level because you're close to challenges, and the constituencies, tend to know each other. They don't live in these separate, silos and these monuments of government. So, look, I think the national government is absolutely essential. I think states are essential. They set a platform for growth, but the work really gets done at the city and metro level. And you could take that flipping of the pyramid, and apply it to England. And obviously that might be a little snarky, but I mean, I think, this country would be much better off with much greater devolution to its cities and to these conurbations. It really, I think, could ultimately catalyze a lot more innovative thinking and cross-sectoral, cross-jurisdictional thinking.
Just to take one particular aspect of this joining up, which we talked about in the launch of the Core Cities Commission on Monday, which is that cities really face two challenges. One is the new model of growth, sustainable long-term growth, not just a kind of rebound growth driven by house prices, which is what we seem to have at the moment. But the other challenge is public service austerity. Now, again, when I worked in government, there was an attempt by the strategy unit to convince the government that public service innovation was not just a matter for public services, but was also a broader issue of economic productivity, which got absolutely nowhere at all as an idea. Is your sense that in cities, those two agendas, better, innovation in services, making services more efficient, more effective, and the economic stuff is joined together?
I think they're absolutely joined together because talent is mobile and firms are mobile, and they're looking for cities that are efficient and that are business friendly and that understand the interplay of governance and markets and sustainability. But also cities are not just governments. Again, I mean, when we think about finance in the United States, particularly given the stresses of municipal finance or the austerity at the state or federal level, we're also looking at civic finance, our philanthropies, or corporate finance, or the large advanced research institutions and medical campuses we have in the United States. So we're really looking at the balance sheet of government and how to make that more efficient and effective, and then the balance sheet of the network and how to leverage and unlock capital from there. And I would say if you go to the United States right now and you go to Philadelphia, right by University of Pennsylvania, Drexel, 30th Street Station, or Houston around the Texas Medical Campus, now connected to the downtown by light rail, or really to any number of our other cities, what you're going to see is incredible growth, redevelopment, reinvestment, the new spatial geography of innovation, basically designed, financed, and delivered by private and civic leaders, with government playing a supportive role, but not the sort of vanguard role.
Just two more questions before we open it up. But on this issue of spatial geography, one of the things that I discovered when I made the program, and I hadn't fully understood this, was after years of experimentation, decades of experimentation with regional government and these kinds of things, there now seems to be a genuine bottom-up movement by local authorities in England to reorganise themselves into more relevant units. So we have in Greater Manchester, Manchester and the surrounding authorities becoming a legal entity and working together rather than the suburbs and the centre competing. And we have moves towards combined authorities, Leeds, Sheffield, North East, places that have always been kind of, at war with each other, very kind of parochial, seeing, as I say, the cities and suburbs in conflict. Now, that's one of the themes of your book, that these successful places that you described, part of the success was an alliance between city and suburb, which often had to cross party affiliations.
That's right. So I think the most interesting story from this perspective in the book is the story of Denver, because Denver's about 2 million people in essentially the middle of nowhere. It doesn't have a advanced research institution. It was an extractive economy for a long period of time. And basically the cities and suburbs were at war with each other over the typical stuff that cities and suburbs are at war in the United States: school integration, racial division, et cetera. They finally, in the 70s, city and county leaders, business and civic leaders said, you know, we just have to collaborate to compete. This is ridiculous. I mean, we're going to be a flyover metro unless we get our act together. So they began doing the easy stuff. They didn't really combine into one authority, but they began to collaborate around arts and culture financing. And then they began to make their way over the tougher stuff, which is ultimately building a state-of-the-art 118-mile light rail system, not just to move people around, but to really change development patterns so greater Denver can become this much more livable, sustainable place. And what we're seeing around the U.S. is this kind of voluntary alignment of cities and suburbs and corporate and civic. I think what's going on in Manchester, I'm going there on Friday, is really quite remarkable, and I think is the kind of, you know, organic bottom-up collaboration, but also the recognition that the real unit of the economy is the metropolis, the commuter shed, the labor market, the housing market, not artificial political borders.
And then final question, which is, you know, in reality, we are a long way away from the division that you've described. There are so many things that are different here. We don't have many mayors. We have centralization of the administration of public services. We have very limited powers to raise money locally. We have very circumscribed powers around spending money locally. So if you were, and I wish you were, but if you were in charge of a strategy for devolution in England, what would you say were the essential elements? Is it raising money locally? Is it more freedom how to spend it? Is it mayors? What are the critical things that we need to do? And you've read the Heseltine report, presumably, so you know what his thoughts are.
Absolutely. Well, I thought the Heseltine report was brilliant, frankly. I would have just said, okay, let's just get on with it. Obviously, that's not what's happening. But I would say there's some platform.
Heseltine said to me,
Heseltine
said to me, you know, because he advocated devolving 85 billion, and I think the government devolved 2 billion.
Right.
But his view is, look, do this slowly, because the whole of Whitehall is waiting for this to go wrong. And the second it goes wrong, it'll retrench. So just have to do this kind of stuff below the radar.
I think that's, and frankly, we have similar conversations in the United States, even though there are a lot of powers at the local level. When federal money flows, it tends to be very prescriptive. It tends to be distorting. It tends to be a one-size-fits-all. When really what governors and mayors and their civic and corporate allies want is the ability to flex money so it aligns with their, you know, very distinctive starting points, as I talked about before. But I think at the central level, you want to make some platform-setting investments in innovation, in infrastructure like high-speed rail, in skills, so that you can begin to align the potential for the reshoring of production. I mean,
But that means letting cities take risks.
Absolutely, and that means there will be failures. And I think that the U.S. will probably be more tolerant, both in the private and the public realms of failure. Particularly in the private side, right? I mean, we see so much of that. But it's this notion of experimentation, continuous innovation, and a circuitry of innovation where you reward people for taking risks when it goes well. So this tax devolution, this revenue raising, is really essential, because when you do smart things, you should be able to keep the rewards as opposed to bundling up the revenues, sending them back to Whitehall to distribute to the rest of the country. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You also want to have a circuitry of innovation that is horizontal rather than vertical. I mean, look at bike sharing. I mean, and how that sort of just blows through cities across the country, or the High Line in every city now thinking about how to recapture these rail beds, you know, for new purposes. Cities observe each other, they replicate, they adapt and tailor faster. It's almost like a market mechanism than central governments or state governments. So, you know, I think there needs to be devolution across multiple levels here, both not just around tax-raising powers or revenue-raising powers, but also flexibility of funding. I would say at the end of the day, probably the most important thing is cultural, or actually rather than more than programmatic, is how do you have people, whether they're elected, whether they're appointed, whether they're in these different sectors, how do we begin to inculcate sort of pragmatic, affirmative risk-taking that is evidence-driven, strategy-driven, held accountable? That's the kind of behavioral change you want to have in a country. It won't come from a program. In the United States, it comes more from philanthropy, basically giving people the ability to take risk. fail, get up and do it again, right? And so it's hard for government to do this. I think in the US, we really look to the philanthropic sector and even increasingly to the corporate sector because they have a big philanthropic, sort of bent to enable this to happen. But at the end of the day, I think this is a radically different century than the 20th century. And we need to understand that is how countries succeed, how they thrive, how they prosper, really will depend on unleashing the latent power of their cities and metropolitan areas.
Okay, let's take some questions and points from the floor. We'll take them in kind of groups of three, and we'll start with the two at the front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Helen Kersley. I'm from the New Economics Foundation. I was really interested, right at the beginning of your talk, you talked about the jobs gap, effectively, and the need not just for more jobs, but better jobs. And if you take some of the examples that you flagged, say New York City, where does that feature in a... Okay, I use the word plan because I know it's not that set in stone. I guess the point is we're seeing a hollowing out of the labour market in the US. Here, we're seeing more and more talk about the need for wages to kind of sustain the economy in the long term. I guess I just have a little bit of nervousness that you have a scheme like in New York, which is about technology. Sure. And is that for the bright sparks who are right up there at the cutting edge of technology? And what about everybody else? So I'm just interested to hear more about how this fits with your point about better jobs.
Sure. Right. Hold that one about the labour market. Yep. And then pass the mic back.
Hi, and James. We have the game changers in the UK, but we don't seem to have the game. And High Speed 2 would be a classic in that. We're typically ambivalent about it. Yeah. And that's our problem. I say that I've just come back from Marseille and Amsterdam and Vancouver, and I've seen these game changers. I think your model is spot on, your three-stage model. What I'm wondering is, can you do it backwards? Is there some way that we could turn the game changers into something else? Because I think you're right. When I go to Vancouver and I find the driver on the bus gets out and helps the person in the wheelchair onto the bus with the wheelchair and wishes them well and all the rest of it, that doesn't feel like UK, you know? So it feels like we need to get this spirit thing going. And I'm wondering how we get our game changers to leverage the change, if that's possible.
Sure. That's partly that point about agency, I think, to a certain extent. And then, yep.
Jim Rooney, RSA Fellow. Bruce, to your call to move beyond an economic model of consumption and debt, is there not a need for a new universal measurement of economic success beyond simply GDP? I mean, despite all the changes in our economy globally and with technology, we're still using the same measurement that doesn't really encourage risk-taking, especially among elected officials.
Sure. Okay, three big questions.
So let's talk about this first question. So if you think about the STEM economy, science, technology, engineering, math, or if you throw in arts in there, particularly at the design element, the industrial design, it's about 20% of the United States economy, maybe 22%. A large portion of the jobs in that economy, and frankly the jobs that will be created off the base of applied sciences in New York, really require sub-baccalaureate degrees. So we're talking about high school plus, technical training, computer sciences in high school, what we used to call vocational education, the trades, shop, and community colleges and career academies that some of the larger companies run. So I think actually we've made the mistake in both of our countries of thinking that the innovative economy were only for, you know, the smart graduates from Stanford or whatever, and when actually a large portion of the jobs in those sectors actually require people with technical trades. And then you have the multiplier effect, obviously, on a good portion of the jobs coming out of the multiplier effect, particularly around trade and logistics, also pay well. So, I mean, what companies are telling me in the United States, and that's the companies I principally engage with, is we have jobs just going wanting, paying $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year. for welders and electricians and all these different, people who understand robotics. And I think we have to go, the President Obama had a program called Race to the Top around educational achievement, which is mostly around 4-year degree achievement. So we have a proposal called Race to the Shop, which is really how do we help large numbers of our young, particularly minorities, because 40% of the American workforce will be Latino and Black in a very short period of time. We have huge educational disparities. How do we build from their natural talents to make things? And I'm believing that this is partly redefinition, but then setting ourselves on task to build hundreds of these career academies all across the United States, and not teaching to test, but promoting school to work the way we used to. In terms of the game changers, I think
the point is here, I think the connection between agency and game changing,
Yes.
and my suspicion is that mayors are important figures in bridging this kind of gap between self-belief and committing to the project.
Yeah, so this is a cultural difference, right? Because the American narrative is an optimistic narrative, and the American narrative is really an immigrant narrative in many ways, right? And in Houston, which is a great story in this book, this neighborhood settlement group really talks about what they call appreciative inquiry, which is really not focusing on immigrants as problems or neighborhoods as challenges, but thinking about the assets and advantages of many of these places and many of these people. I mean, it's just flipping it. I mean, not in a Pollyannish way, but in a way where you really can help people realize their potential and help them achieve it, and the same with community, and the same with city, and the same with metropolis. I never get very far in any American city or metropolis just laying out the tale of woe. Everyone knows the tale of woe. What they really want to do is problem solve and crack the code and be a first mover on something that's important. So this is cultural. I mean, and we need to, this is a great country, and it's not great because of its history. It's great because of its presence, of the present and the future. If it can really sort of unveil its hidden assets and leverage them, not just in the great city of London, but really throughout the country. So this is partly about the paradigm, the mental map, and how people can be inspired and catalyzed to do great things.
And that links into the third point
And
about,
the third
about
point,
assets.
yeah.
What do we understand city assets as being?
Well, I think we don't have the right measures, and I would say, Adam, so GDP is one challenge, and I think people are trying to sort of assess how to remeasure that. I guess I'm more focused on the way we silo measure. So when we think about cities, we tend to think about, let's look at the housing health, and let's look at small business growth, and let's look at some other kinds of investments happening off the cultural institutions or off the eds and meds. Actually, cities have more of a synergistic, integrated effect. Alicia Glenn, at Goldman Sachs, calls cities their own separate asset class, because they're so integrated. So in a way, what we need to do is have measures move from compartmentalized, kind of silo-driven, looks at different market activity within cities and the synergistic effect, because they're all reinforcing. And that's what's particularly happening right now in the downtowns and midtowns of American cities. They're taking off because they're finally in this new network, technologically connected, transit-connected era. They're realizing their true fundamental, full potential. So I think we're going to come up with new measures. There's some talk about happiness as the new. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so I'm never really happy. You know what I mean? I'm really trying to make other people happy by having good jobs and better jobs. Happiness seems a little attenuated to me.
Let's take a final set of questions. So, Anthony in the back.
Anthony Painter, I work here at the RSA. I'm interested in the sort of model of leadership that you advocate to initiate the sort of change that you're talking about, because you talk about leadership, I think, in very entrepreneurial terms. It's strategic, evidence-driven, sectorised. But to really sort of leverage the economic and social impacts that you're talking about, it needs that sort of engaging leadership that brings in the sort of civic and population into the whole enterprise. So how far do you think those two aspects of leadership are compatible? And how do we get the sort of leaders that we need in order to make them compatible?
Very good. Yep, and the gentleman here.
Hi, Michael Paulin, architect and fellow of the RSA. With the devolution of power away from central governments, do you think that's going to make it easier or more difficult to bring about international agreements on issues like climate change, but not just that, perhaps others that are less directly connected with cities, like perhaps marine pollution?
Yep. And I'll pass the microphone forward, and then we'll take one here and one here.
Anita Panwani, fellow. How well organised are the community environmental pressure groups, and how much influence do they have on developments in metros?
Okay, and then finally here.
Kippen, I interviewed Benjamin Barber for the RSA Journal a few months ago and asked him this question, so I'm going to ask you as well. What does your inverted model mean for people who either don't live in the right city or don't live in cities at all? There was a piece in The Economist a couple of weeks ago which advocated that some of the northern cities that aren't experiencing the kind of flourishing that you describe should move, frankly. Yeah. So what's your response to that argument?
We had Richard Florida here a few months ago, and I overheard two people walking down the stairs after listening to him saying, this guy really needs to go to Stoke-on-Trent. Yeah. So, I'm sure you've heard this before. So, 4 different questions.
So, on that question, several different responses. The United States declared New York City dead in 1970. Right, there was actually the famous, sort of daily news or New York Post sort of headline from Gerald Ford. We declared Boston dead. We declared Philly dead. We declared all our cities dead. So things change, right, because of demographic and market and environmental dynamics. And so that's one critical piece. The other piece is the U.S. is the land of mobility. So, we're taught at a very early age, just because you grow up somewhere doesn't mean you need to live there. And, so there's a lot more mobility, and people are always looking for choices and opportunities at all ages. I'm not just talking about the young and the talented. I'm talking really across the board. And the last piece is, I think what we need to start doing is talking about the unified narrative between cities and suburbs, or metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas, because there really are very different roles these different places play, and there are synergistic effects. So when I think about rural America, which is only 9% of our GDP, what I think about is the energy resourcing they can provide, or the agricultural products, which are highly dependent on having modern infrastructure. I don't think it's about the metros versus the non-metros. I think it's the metros and the non-metros together understanding how they're connected and how they can be leveraged. So I hope that's responsive. In terms of the health and environmental groups in the United States at the local level, it varies. It varies. I could take you to a state like Maine, where there's just a proliferation, a plethora of environmental groups protecting every stream, protecting every forest, sometimes protecting every tree, as far as I can tell. It's just this ethic of people that live in a state like Maine, or frankly in a state like Colorado, this fundamental sensitivity to the environment, which is wonderful. And that allows you to have a platform for not just a quality and livable and environmentally sustainable place. That's a platform for markets. Look at Portland, Oregon, which did all the right things on sustainable growth, and then wake up 40 years later and say, wait, we have all these firms now who came here because they wanted to be an environmentally sensible place and sensitive place, and now we can export products and services to China so they can breathe the air and drink the water. So it varies in the U.S. It would be wonderful if there was, more environmental, sort of advocacy and constituencies everywhere. But I think it's sort of, this will become, the sort of wave of the future.
Part of the, part of the HS2 story here is, people saying don't build a railway through my farm, and suddenly people are discovering bits of land which mustn't be touched and all that. So is it possible to mobilise those groups as part of these big plans? Because I think there's an assumption in England that they will tend to be the first ones to say no, don't change stuff.
Well, I think, yeah, I can understand that, and I think it's, people always need to be thinking about the bigger picture, really, is what the deal is here. And I think in the U.S.,
I mean, it goes towards Angela's point. So maybe we come back to the second question, which is this relationship between technocratic governance
right.
and kind of engagement governance.
Yeah, I do just a few other sort of little bits and sort of connecting. So I think it gets this other question about if you devolve, how do you do the big national stuff, right? I think actually the more cities and metros on the front lines of environmental change and obviously of climate change, the more they crack the code on the new low carbon growth, the more likely that federal officials, national officials will feel that they have the room to sort of do the right thing, right? And actually can build from the pragmatic affirmative energy, so to speak, of these, lower, I hate to talk about the lower level or the bottom or the ground, because I think actually they are on the top, but let's just go with the usual lexicon. So I think the more activity at the local level, the more that pragmatism and that knowledge that comes from innovation affects how national government even thinks about their role. Because right now they're thinking about it in these technocratic kind of fixes, programmatic kind of fixes. And really, there's something much more exciting out there to be unleashed from private, civic, public, right? It's the mashup of everything that really matters.
And one of the points that Ben Barber makes is that actually cities don't see international cooperation as a zero-sum game.
Yeah, absolutely.
They see it as a positive-sum game. And so the networks that are emerging amongst city leaders, for example, are very positive and they're growing and more deals. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, you can go, when you go to these big climate sort of confabs, you have the national leaders, looking like they're national leaders. There's a sense of hubris. I mean, there's a sense of we're the masters of the universe, and therefore they're more clashing with each other. When mayors see each other, they're hugging, they're slapping each other's back. It's like, hey, we just did that. Oh, did you do that? Oh, they're sharing lessons. It's a completely different style, right, of action, which is why I love working at the local level, because it's not like everyone loves each other or gets along, but they clearly put place over party and collaboration over conflict. They're not scoring political points. They're not, they're not watching their back. They're really moving forward. It really gets to this last point about how do we teach all of this? Because I think, when new mayors are elected to in the United States, there's a sense of what we need to teach them is programmatic. Here's this new corporation you're now taking over called the municipal government, and let's tell you what the balance sheet looks like, and let's tell you about the org chart and all your formal power. And what we really need to be teaching everyone is this culture of collaboration and this notion of informal power and how you convene stakeholders and how you catalyze and inspire a community to move forward, even when faced with some really difficult starting points. And the U.S. is just, really at the end of the day, a series of unlikely, leaders. We call it the post-hero economy. We're all looking for the charismatic leader, to sort of lead the charge, right? But actually what we have are a lot of quiet folks who are very knowledgeable and about their place and cognizant of the possibilities, the glue between all these different sectors. And mayors need to sort of learn that, really, is that their power lies in being democratically legitimate, right? Having the sort of mandate of the citizenry. They're true public servants rather than political servants. They're not serving a party or an ideology. Most elections in the United States are nonpartisan for mayor. So, this informal power is really, I think, the most important thing to teach. And there again, it comes back to culture, behavior, reaching out rather than staying within. I mean, basic sort of sandbox principles you learned when you were 2 or 3 years old that now gets applied onto the municipal or global stage. So You know, I think this is sort of a liberating, exhilarating period in not just in the United States, but here as well. There's so much to be unleashed. There's so much talent to be tapped. But first we need the different mental map of the economy. We need to think differently about how to lift up millions of people in our society so they can be productive and entrepreneurial citizens. But then we just have to offer, very sort of these concrete, tangible roadmaps to prosperity that really are affirmative in vision. I mean, I think in our country, people are waiting to be inspired again. I think the Obama election was part of that. But now I think the inspiration is really coming closer to ground in much more tangible, concrete ways that people can sort of touch and feel and even taste. So, great times.
Well, I hope you've been inspired, as I always am when I listen to Bruce. If you want to know more about the case studies he's describing, what Bruce hasn't had the time to do is to really take apart some of these case studies and the position that some of these places were in and the trajectory they took and the critical path. The book, Metropolitan Revolution, which is available outside and which Bruce is happy to kind of stay and to sign copies of, goes into those case studies in much more depth. And if you really want to understand this story, you do need to kind of to see the whole picture in these places like Denver and New York and what happened. So I'd encourage you to get it. It's a fantastic read. Thank you all for joining us today. Can you just join me in thanking Bruce Katz?
Thanks a lot.